Let's talk about hell. My name's Logan. I'm an ex-pastor and also a deconstructed Christian, hovering somewhere between radical fundamentalist evangelical and raging militant atheist. I realize that's a very broad range. Doesn't really give you a lot to go on. I'm as confused as you are in that situation. But yeah, so I posted a video about hell on Easter, which went about as well as you would expect. You can watch it now. You probably need to watch it before you watch the rest of this video, if you haven't yet. I stopped believing in hell not because of some theological argument, but because of her, Juanita, a teenage girl sacrificed on a mountain 500 years ago, her body preserved in the ice caps of the Andes. I was taught that the moment after the stone axe struck her temple, she would have awoken to an eternity of torment, all because she was born in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she never got to hear the gospel. Her fate would have been the same as most humans for most of human history, like these lovers in ancient Italy, or this happy guy eating rice, the boy who played with this toy, this mom and her baby, the people who built Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, Göbekli Tepe, Cahokia, Teotihuacan, Angkor Wat, the people who danced at the summer solstice and baked bread and wore makeup, the people who buried their dogs and got married and liked looking at the stars and making art, who told their kids spooky stories around the fire. All of them so human, like you and me. All of them burning, tortured, forever. This was the great rescue plan of a loving God. Just maybe that's not the way it all works. If there is a heaven, I believe Juanita will be there, happy and safe from the religion that killed her. And if I end up being tortured for all of eternity by a God who claims to love me simply because he chose to create me with a hardened mind too curious and empathetic to keep him locked in the box my culture created for him, well, I don't know that that's a God I'd want to spend eternity with anyways. So, yeah, I feel like that video warranted a longer conversation. And I realize that this isn't a conversation, it's a monologue. I don't know. I don't have enough people in real life to talk about this with in an intimate way. People who would dialogue about this kind of stuff for fun anyways. I try to with people and I think I mostly bore them. So I'm going to bore you all instead. Holding the microphone like this because this is what the youths do nowadays, apparently. It's not cool to clip it on anymore. So I hear. I don't know. I'm just trying to keep up with the times. So I've actually already recorded this video once, and it was essentially like a response video to all of the replies I got. I got over 1,500 comments on that video, over 1,200 comments, and a lot of them were just really dumb. The Catholic faith doesn't teach this at all. What's wrong with you? I'm one of the over 1 billion people who was raised as a Christian that wasn't Catholic. Who are you people? And I was going to respond to a lot of them, a lot of common critiques, replies, but it felt pretty dumb too. And I'm kind of practicing this thing where I don't have to always prove that I'm right about everything because, well, of course, A, I'm not, and B, it's just you can't do it. You can't reply to every comment. You can't win every argument, even if you are right, but especially because you're not always right. And I don't know, it felt not good. So I am reshooting this video in hopefully a much more authentic way. I'm actually really glad that the YouTube algorithm is kind of getting away from those very polished, very cinematic, nicely cut videos because, dude, I can do it. I don't know if I can do it well. I know the basics, but it's just so much work, man. And actually, I think it's actually harder to talk uninterrupted and be interesting and be engaging with fewer cuts. It's actually harder than I think the work it takes to make something that's well scripted. So this is going to be unscripted. I didn't bring any charts with me, any maps, any statistics, any books about theology. What this video is going to be is... let me tell you what this video is not going to be. This video is not going to be me doing a deep dive on theology or biblical scholarship around the idea of hell. I'm not qualified for that. I actually think most pastors are not qualified for that, but that's a whole other story. There's lots of people who have done that and continue to do that. I can put some resources in the description of this video if that's something that you are interested in. But I do like engage with a lot of that kind of content and scholarship, etc. So I probably will be throwing some of that in there. But just as a caveat at the beginning of this video, please understand that I don't know what I'm talking about. I mean, like, I know enough theology and enough biblical scholarship to get everything like slightly incorrect. So maybe like take everything that I say about that with a grain of salt. So my goal is not to give you some sort of theological answers for how does hell work or why do I not believe in hell the way that I used to. Instead, what I would like to do is use this as an opportunity to use theology as a lens through which to talk about the human experience, which I do feel qualified to do because I'm a human and I'm having an experience, and so are you. So I want to use theology as a lens to talk about the human experience, to talk about the way that we interact with other humans and with religion as a concept and with religious institutions, and just about how the theology around hell has influenced my own life, but just all of us. Everyone has a story, I feel like, about hell, about being told they could be going to hell, or someone else they know is going to hell, or telling somebody else that they're going to hell. And there's many different ways that can happen. So buckle up. So before we can get too far into this whole conversation, we've got to start at the beginning. For me, where did I come from? Where am I going? Who am I? So I was spent 30 years in essentially the same church. Went to the church when I was about 3 weeks old. Left the church at about 31 years old. And this church was a non-denominational church in a rural community called San Angelo in West Texas. And if I remember correctly, it was founded as like a Disciples of Christ church or some kind of denomination like that, or maybe just founded in affiliation with it. But by the time I was growing up in it in the 90s, it was or the late 1900s, as the youths would say. Oh God, I'm so old. Anyways, it was non-denominational by the time I was coming up and about. And yeah, grew up in that church, ended up pastoring in that church, not as the senior pastor, but filled a couple of different roles. But within that non-denominational church, you don't, unless you're part of like a weird cult, you're never just in one church, right? You're going to your friends' churches sometimes on the weekends. You're going to conferences at other churches in town and at other places. You're going to worship concerts. You're going to summer camps where lots of other churches come. So even though I was in this one specific non-denominational church, I was in this greater kind of locus, this greater, what would you call it? Like, hold on, I'm going to pause this while I think of the word. This greater interconnected web of different Protestant churches throughout America. And this is what demographers will refer to as like white American evangelicalism. If you're curious why I say white American evangelicalism, it's because, again, demographically speaking, there's a lot of differences between American evangelical churches that are predominantly white versus American evangelical churches that are predominantly black. Their theology is pretty different as far as like what they emphasize. So black churches emphasize a lot of liberation theology because, again, a lot of them are descendants of people who were enslaved. So they have a lot of that kind of like Moses coming out of, leading people out of Egypt imagery. It's actually stuff that's like really beautiful that I was never exposed to, that I wish I would have been, but, it's just the luck of the draw, I guess. So their theology is quite a bit different, but also, they vote very differently. Their services can kind of be run very differently. So demographically speaking, it is... I always say this because anytime I bring it up, people are always like, well, you go so white. Why you gotta make everything about race? Because race, even if it is a social construct, is like a pretty big thing. And it does actually influence, again, the demographics of how people vote, how people organize, the theology that people believe in. So that was a bit of a tangent. Let's keep going. So within this greater web of American evangelicalism, I would describe the theology as like a mix of some like Reformed Calvinist stuff over here, and then you've got to like your Southern Baptist kind of theology, the people who like were really against alcohol for some reason, and then you've got the more charismatic stream that really kind of got going, especially after like the Toronto revival or whatever it was, and then IHOP, and then Bethel. Hillsong got really big, so That was more like in the aughts, in the 2010s, I would say. So you have kind of all these different streams. And since our church was a non-denominational church, this is probably should have been a red flag from the beginning, but we didn't really have a like an official stance on a lot of stuff, you could say. In fact, I remember right before I left the church that I was in, was having a conversation with the pastor at the time, and I remember asking point blank, like, "Hey, pastor, in our church, can women be pastors or can they not be pastors?" Because like that's a yes or no question. You have to decide that. It's and honestly, I wasn't like asking him to pick one. I was asking him to pick a position because like that is a binary, right? Like you can either ordain women or you cannot ordain women. And what he literally told me was, that's something I don't want to make a decision about because it will cost you no much division. That's something that your generation can take care of. Which the way he said it kind of sounded eloquent, but upon second listening after the conversation, I was like, that's pretty messed up. You're essentially admitting that you're a coward and that you're not willing to take a stance on something because you know it's going to drive people away. But what he didn't realize was he was actually driving a ton of people away by not putting his foot down about anything. Anyways, another tangent. Man, this video might not be about hell. This might just be me rambling for an hour about church. We'll see. Where was I? Oh yeah, theology. I was essentially taught that theology that was in that video. The idea that people who died never hearing the name of Jesus and saying the sinner's prayer and giving their life to Jesus would end up going to hell. And what's interesting is that I can't recall maybe once or twice, but very many times, if at all, of like explicitly being taught this. But I was absolutely implicitly taught this. And I want to make sure that there's a distinction there. Because what the distinction is that explicitly taught something means that you were taught it verbatim, word for word, like this is what this means. Where things that are implicitly taught are things that are taught without actually people using words, right? So if somebody teaches that if somebody teaches that A equals B and B equals C, that's explicit. But what they're implicitly teaching you is that A equals C. Now, they're never saying that with their words, but if you just like think about it for more than a few seconds, you realize like, oh, A equals C. And so you're still being taught that because of how all the pieces are fitting together, even if you're not being taught it word for word. But then if you bring up that A equals C, people get really awkward and then like try to come up with, well, maybe there was some way that like Jesus reached them. This analogy is breaking down. But yes, that was essentially what we were taught. And the way that it's taught implicitly, or maybe even explicitly, is it's always like the second to last night of camp, right? And the preacher gets up there with his little goatee and he's like, if you died tonight, do you know where you would spend eternity? Which again implies that if you don't accept Jesus in your heart, you're going to hell. And yeah, and this is an experience that I realized like most people have had. And I want to get into this a little bit about the fact that most people who are in that stream of evangelicalism that I was in claim to believe this theology, but I don't think they actually do. I think they do insofar as they feel the need to remain in good standing with their social group and to not have anxiety about believing the wrong thing that their spiritual authorities told them was true. But I don't think people actually believe it because from what I experienced, like everybody I've talked to as a kid, even as an 8-year-old, as a 9-year-old, is like, that doesn't make sense. But hey, maybe we're wrong. But yeah, as a kid, I remember thinking, that feels weird. So this is one of those things that I thought about pretty deeply as a kid. By the time I was a teenager, I kind of suppressed it. Not so much because I like got answers or learned to stop asking questions about it. But I think once I became a teenager, I think a lot of my thinking and doing around church and theology was more about like my personal relationship with Jesus, and I wasn't thinking so much about the humanity as a whole and like all of the humans that have ever lived. And I think that was probably by design, maybe not intentionally, or maybe definitely intentionally. You're kind of taught, I think, in American evangelicalism, in white American evangelicalism, to think about salvation and faith and the gospel primarily through a lens of your own personal experience as an individual, and maybe in some instances about the nations, about the lost people that are out there today. But it's pretty rare in my experience to have a theology that takes into account like all of the humans that have ever existed. Especially because then you have to get into the whole question of like biblical literalism and like, was there an Adam and Eve or did we evolve? And you kind of can't get into like scaling up the thought process about all of the humans that have ever existed without talking about that big can of worms, which I don't think is a big can of worms. I think we can all just admit that Genesis is like myth by now. It's just so weird to me that there's grown adults out there still believing Noah's Ark. That's another tangent. Not going there. What was I even talking about again? Now I'm just angry at Ken Ham. So for me, it wasn't really until I was kind of in the midst of deconstructing my faith and had reached a point where I was comfortable kind of asking these questions again that I began to engage with this idea again about like, this just doesn't really make sense. Like the gospel, as I was taught it, is statistically not good news. Like if you think about all of the humans that have ever existed, and first of all, most of them died before the age of like 30. But also, like, even up until today, where we do have, like, 2 billion Christians, something like that. Most people have ever lived in Asia, where Christianity has never been the major religion. So even just, like, that fact right there. But then you factor in, again, all of the Americas, all of the Aboriginal Australians, so much of the interior of Africa, most of Asia for most of human history. And yeah, like, again, so like people who would be in hell, according to the Southern Baptists or the Calvinists, most people. Yeah, most people. And so, like, I don't think that you can actually call the gospel good news. Like, good news for you, sure, but the analogy I like to use is like, imagine there's a comet heading to Earth. This is going to be weird. It's going to make sense at the end. Just wait for me, okay? Imagine there's a comet hitting the Earth, and then it's like, hey, this is going to wipe out the entire human population. And then before it hits though, there's a guy that's like, hey, I built all of these underground safe houses and there's enough room for the whole human population, but we're only going to tell 30% of the population. Everyone else is just going to die, even though they don't have to. Or, and again, okay, I got to shore this up because the Theo bros are going to come at me with theology about this one. So let's say, the point being is that some catastrophe happened where 30%, let's say, of humanity survived. Like, you wouldn't be excited about that, right? You would think, man, would have been great if it could have just been like 100 or, at least like 85. So anyways, I just use that analogy to say, like, can you really call it good news? I don't know. There's just so many holes in that theory, too, about the idea. Because I also grew up essentially kind of being taught biblical literalism. Like, there's not a whole lot of allegory or analogy in the Bible. So, like, Genesis was 100% true. And so, if that's the case, then, like, man, Noah's Ark is a pretty messed up story. Because it basically means that God killed everybody because they were evil, but because of the doctrine of original sin, even Noah's offspring were still going to end up being evil again. So, like, nothing's really accomplished there other than you just killed a bunch of people. But also, if the whole idea is that, like, everyone who believes in Jesus is saved, why not just, like, have Jesus be born and then crucified like a generation or two after Noah, and then there's only like 100 people around. They all know him. They all tell everyone else about him. Bada bing, bada boom. I realize that's low-hanging fruit. But seriously. That was a cat in the background. That was Franklin. He's kind of an asshole. What are you doing, cat? But one of the big things that I think needs to be talked about that for some reason is never talked about. Actually, it's not for some reason. I know exactly the reason. But it's never talked about is the fact that the theology of hell and Satan particularly and demons is a theology that developed over time. So like all of the people in the Old Testament would not have thought about Satan the way that I or like most people today think about Satan as this sort of cosmic malevolence that's just totally opposed to God and that is leading legions of demons, right? I'm actually reading a book about this right now. It's just a total coincidence that happened to be when I'm talking about this. I'm going to go get it. Don't go anywhere. Yeah, so this is called The Origin of Satan by Elaine Pagels. Bagels? Anyways, yeah, it's stuff like the broad strokes of it are stuff I was already kind of familiar with, but lots of stuff I just had no idea about. So yeah, that's why I don't make videos about biblical scholarship, because I'll leave it up to the biblical scholars. But yeah, man, like even in this book, she talks about how the first reference of Satan is actually in the story of like Balaam's donkey, and it's an angel of the Lord who is sent by the Lord to be the Satan, which means like the one who obstructs the way, the accuser. So the Satan was a title, right? Not a proper noun, not the name of a person. But then as you kind of trace the story of Israel and of the Jewish people through the first temple period and the Hasmonean dynasty and the Herodian dynasty and the Second Temple period and the Roman War, the First Roman War, Second Roman War. Man, there's so many wars. As you trace that story, you begin to see the development of Satan as this divine figure, and begin to see the formation of hell as this place of everlasting torment, which I feel like is something that just not enough people of like religious disposition are willing to wrestle with. Like the people who really truly believe this, because it basically means one of two things, right? It either means that what is true about Satan and hell and demons has changed over time. That doesn't seem very likely, right? That would be kind of weird. Or it means that we got it wrong, like the people of God, like the Jews, and then the Christians. Because again, it was also, a lot of time, even after Christianity got started, that these ideas were fully fleshed out. So either what was true about hell and demons and Satan changed over time, which doesn't really make sense, or God was just like okay with his people being totally wrong about it for centuries and centuries, which you would think that if there's, again, this sort of cosmic malevolence that's out to get you prowling around, that you would kind of like tell your people about it in a way that makes sense. But, the theology around that is the idea of continuing revelation, that God is, continually or over a period of time, pouring out the revelation about himself and how everything works over time. Which, I mean, maybe, sure, I think what seems a lot more likely is that humans just made it up. But again, if your goal is to preserve your worldview, you can just keep layering theology on top of it. I mean, that's why we have all of these big books. That's why the Trinity exists, in my opinion. People were reading those early Christian texts and were like, hey, some of this doesn't make sense. Let's create this really complicated doctrine to make it all make sense. That's very reductionistic take. Please don't come at me with that. So yeah, again, you have this question of if hell is something that developed over time and that was shaped and formed by different cultural ideas and things that were going on, then how can we really say what's true about it? Again, that's why I think the easiest thing to say is was just humans made it up. But I think, and this is where we kind of get into the whole using theology as a lens to talk about the human experience, what's really fascinating is to look at how and why hell developed into the way that it is, which this is getting a little into the weeds. That's kind of beyond my pay grade. So this is where I'm going to be slightly wrong. But from what I can remember, from what I've read, again, this is just me stream of consciousness with nothing prepared. The idea of hell as this place of everlasting torment was really born out of this idea of the Jewish people trying to reconcile their theology around Yahweh with what they were seeing and experiencing as a people. Because their theology was this idea that Yahweh was their God who was, like this warrior God who was going to deliver them from the people who were inhabiting their land or from the people who were keeping them captive. And, that's why you have like the whole Exodus story. But then that like just doesn't happen. And so, you have Babylon, Persia, you have Alexander the Great, Ptolemaic people, and then you got the Romans, and it's just kind of occupation after occupation, and for generations and generations, the bad guys keep getting away with it, right? The bad guys keep getting what they want, and the people of God are just never having their prayers answered. And so, in a way, and I don't know if this probably isn't the only reason that hell kind of developed the way it did, of course, but from what I understand, hell developed through the Jewish lens as a way of kind of reconciling this idea that God was the ultimate justice bringer, and yet he wasn't bringing justice. Because if your worldview says God is always going to bring justice, but then you never see justice for centuries, and it becomes almost a way of life to always have injustice, then again, what are you going to do if you want to preserve your worldview? You just add on more theology. And so then it became this thing about, well, God is going to bring justice, but it's all going to come at the end of days, right? Whenever he's going to make everything right, the upside down kingdom, the apocalypse happens, the unveiling, the revealing of God's justice. And that's when the people who are the bad guys, that's when they'll face justice. And that's like the hope that we have, is that even when we experience injustice in this life, justice is coming one day. So yeah, kind of hell was born out of this realization that injustice is happening in the world. And yet the worldview that they had was that justice was supposed to come. So how do you reconcile what you believe to be true with what you're observing? And I think that honestly, like so much of theology is just that, is I have this thing that I believe to be true, and yet I'm seeing this other thing that has evidence of being true, and those two things seem to be conflicting. How do I make those two things fit together? I think that's kind of where most religion comes from, actually. I feel like I'm having an epiphany here. I don't know. I got to explore this a little more. There's probably like a dozen books about this. But yeah, this idea of this kind of apocalyptic idea of the world is going to end soon and God is going to bring about the ultimate justice for his people. That's the cultural context that Jesus came out of, right? It was during the Second Temple period, during the Roman occupation. I actually really like another book I just finished reading was, I don't remember the title, it was Bart Ehrman. He's a very prolific scholar, but talks a lot about the idea of Jesus as an apocalyptic preacher. So that would have been something that was a thing back in the day during the first century, was people walking around talking about, hey, the world's going to end soon. And the thing is I think that's kind of still what we use it for today. Not only hell, but also heaven. That really they're spiritual tools to help us navigate the pain of injustice. And because you think about people who were so kind and loved the Lord and did everything right, and yet were killed in a car wreck or got cancer. That also feels like an injustice. But it's kind of the inverse, because it's an injustice that can be remedied by saying, well, we'll see them again one day. That God has ultimately healed them. And on the other side of my faith transition, it's hard to not see these conversations around heaven and hell without seeing it through the lens of just realizing that it's so incredibly hard to be a human being, and that we are willing to believe whatever it takes to hold on to the idea that justice will come in some shape or form. And that hope of the coming justice is what keeps us going. Which is why I don't really try to convince people that heaven or hell aren't real, to an extent. I mean, again, obviously, I'm okay with that a little bit if I made a viral video that did it. Because I do think that there are versions of hell that are really, or versions of that theology that's really harmful. Obviously, the idea of hell and the way that I was taught it, I've already kind of talked about why I think that's pretty bad. But also, the idea of heaven, I think, can be really detrimental to society. Because I grew up surrounded by adults who were pretty checked out about everything happening. And the reason was because, like, I'm just a stranger passing through this world. This body's just a vessel. And it was like they were so heavenly minded. They kind of used it. I wouldn't say they necessarily did this actively, like consciously, but maybe subconsciously used it as an excuse to remain ignorant about certain things, about injustices in the world. You know, they don't care about climate change because, you know, God's coming back. And for what it's worth, like, if I believed what they believe still to a T, I may be the same way. I call this evacuation theology because it's the idea that God's going to zap us up in the rapture one day, and then we'll all be in heaven with him together, which is like super unbiblical even. It's like, that's terrible theology. Rapture's only like 200 years old. But also, that's not even like what the Bible's about, man. The Bible's about bringing heaven to earth. It's about the renewal of creation. And the problem with that is that kind of philosophy around heaven actually like requires something of you, right? On earth as it is in heaven. It's something that's this gradual process that's already happening now versus we're just waiting for our big house in the sky, you know? That version of heaven doesn't require you to really do anything but tithe 10% and then die. But the idea of heaven being something that we bring to earth through living like Jesus, that's like a lot harder to do, man. Man, am I preaching right now? This is weird. Okay. I guess what I'm really getting into is that kind of all of this heaven and hell talk, it's just all about making you feel better, I think, in a lot of ways. But that's been the wildest thing to me about letting go of the certainty around heaven and hell and the afterlife. I mean, obviously, the biggest thing is like coming to terms with the fact that I may die and then that's it. Like, that's kind of hard to wrestle with as somebody who never grew up with that. But I think that one of the other big things is the realization that this earth might be the only earth we get, and that this life, this timeline on earth might be the only chance we get for justice. Like, there may not be a cosmic justice that's coming, in which case it is up to us to try to bring as much justice as we can and to try to fight as much injustice as we can. And that feels like a heavier burden than just waiting for heaven, right? And I think that you can still have that mindset within Christianity, not the brand of Christianity that I was in, obviously, but like, I still think there's some meat there, if you will. But I think another big thing is hell. Let's be honest, like, this is something I haven't brought up yet, like an hour into this video, and that's that hell is used for control. Like, that's the biggest thing, I think, is that you have this message about the good news of the gospel, which is great. But if that message of the good news of the gospel is paired with the fact that if you don't accept it, you're going to be tortured for all of eternity, then, like, what are you really accepting? Like, what, you know what I mean? Like, what's the transaction there that's happening between you and God? Because we talk about how great it is, but, like, if you remove hell from the equation, how many people are still going to care about being a Christian? Obviously not everyone would not. There's plenty of people who would still be. I didn't deconstruct because I thought, oh, heaven's fake, I guess I'll just quit believing in Jesus. But I think if you look throughout so much of history, this is kind of the common thread, is hell is this looming, terrifying thing that's used to scare you into believing. And when you think about it that way, you realize, okay, yeah, most of theology is about creating social boundaries, about this is how our community acts, these are the things that we do, this is what it's going to look like. And the way that we maintain those social boundaries is with the threat of divine punishment. And so I think it makes perfect sense, not like in a good way, but it makes perfect sense that hell formed and was shaped into kind of the idea that we have of it now. It's something that I am also wrestling with as somebody who was not just in the church, but also preaching in the church. And I can't recall ever like preaching fire and brimstone, and again, explicitly teaching that, like, hey, if you don't accept Jesus in your heart, you're going to be tortured for all eternity. But I was still part of the system that taught that. I did still technically believe it. I still, I'm sure, taught it implicitly. And, I've spent the past few years kind of like recovering from evangelicalism and healing wounds, you could say, church wounds, religious wounds. But I think that once you're kind of through that process, which I would say I'm pretty much through that process, I think you have an obligation to turn around and then do what you can to address the wounds that you also created in other people. And I think for me, as someone who was a pastor, I was part of this system that people, especially people who maybe were sinners, people that we would think of as not fitting the mold, would have been really harmed by. And if that was you, I just want to say I'm sorry. I could just blame it on my upbringing, but I was part of that system that told people they were going to burn in hell for all of eternity for being gay, or for having been born with another religion and not choosing to reject it. And I think that was wrong. And I want to admit that it was wrong. So I don't say that for like points or sympathy because you like me, but again, I feel like I'm entering a phase of my life of having healed from some of the wounds I got, now feeling like I need to turn around and make amends. And maybe it doesn't mean much coming from somebody who's no longer like an American evangelical pastor. And anyways, if this video ends up blowing up, which I don't think it will, but if it did, and a bunch of Theo bros end up responding to me about why I'm wrong theologically, I don't give a shit, honestly. So don't waste your time. Because I'm really like entering into a phase of my life where I'm kind of coming full circle, having done so many deep dives into the biblical scholarship and theology, where I'm just coming around to the point where I really am starting to not really care about what is true about ultimate reality. Mostly because I think we can't know. I think the jury's always going to be out on that one. But I remember watching this video a while back. Totally blew my mind. And it was a Q&A session with a Catholic nun. And one of the questions that she was asked was, how do you know all of this is true? And her response was incredible. Without missing a beat, she said, I don't know that any of it is true, and I have no way to prove it. But what I do know is true is that this is the most beautiful way for me to live my life. And I just think that that's the coolest response. I mean, obviously, I don't agree with her in the sense that I'm not like a Catholic monk. I don't also think that specific way of building my life would be the most beautiful way. But yeah, the idea of being less concerned about what is ultimately true, which version of theology, which one of the 40,000 different denominations is the correct one. I'm just a lot more concerned with, am I loving people well? Which is something I feel like I got a lot of work to do in that department. But yeah, something tells me that if I just focus on that rather than what's the proper interpretation of all the scriptures around Hades and Sheol, that I'll be on the right track. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to focus on loving people, regardless of where we all may end up. And who knows, maybe I'll still get thrown in hell, because as much as you love people, unless you subscribe to the proper truth claims about a 2,000-year-old itinerant Jewish apocalypticist, you go to hell. Something tells me that that's not the case. But at any rate, that's what I'm going to be thinking about. How do I love people well? Because I got one chance of being alive. and I don't want to waste it.